Happy holidays, everybody. Making sure I'm not on mute because we made that mistake last year this time around. But happy holidays. Welcome to our final webinar of our 2022 webinar season. You've stayed with us throughout the winter, the spring, the fall, and the summer, and now we are wrapping it all up. Today, we have a great roundtable prepared for you. It will be facilitated by our Executive Director at Fourth, Jeff Allen. And we also have some fabulous speakers that will be joining Jeff Allen on the roundtable. My name is Simbiat Yusuf. I am the current Member Relations Manager at Fourth. Attendees, we ask that you submit all of your questions via the attendee chat. This is a roundtable, no presentations prepared, just a conversation, and your questions will be answered. If you have any problems, we will be sharing the webinar recording with you all after the webinar, so stay tuned for that. And if you have time and you want to view all of our webinars while you're on the holiday break, you can also view them. We'll share the recording with you all. And finally, as we wrapped up, who are we? If you're new to our webinar series, Fourth, we are on a mission to electrify transportation. We bring people together and we're creating solutions for a clean and equitable transportation future. We work in 5 focus areas. We have our access to electric cars team, our access to charging team, our events and partnerships, policy advocacy, and access to emerging modes. You might have seen all of those team leads in 1 or 2 of the webinars during the year, but we also want to take this opportunity to thank all of our members and our sponsors for their help throughout the year. We can't bring our programs to you all without their support, so this is an opportunity to thank them. And speaking about seeing you all, we hope we see you all next year, May 15th through the 17th at the Roadmap Conference. You want to take advantage of up to 40% discount on tickets with our early bird rate, which ends January 16th. If you have any questions about registration, the program, or what's happening, or you're interested in sponsoring, this is a great time. You can find more information on our website at roadmap4.org, or you can reach out via the Roadmap website as well. And now, without further ado, drum roll, I'm going to pass it along to the facilitator today, Jeff.
And I'm clearly struggling with the technology this morning, but great to be with you all. I have my Santa tie on. It's that time of year when we get to look back and reflect on everything that has happened. And boy, this has been a big year. I'm excited to have our panel with us today. Let me go ahead and introduce the panel. Actually, let me give you a little bit of a background, just a refresher here first. So I said it's been a big year, and I think most of you on this call don't need to be told that. But let's just recap a few things. If we want to talk about policy, we can cheat a little bit and stretch back just over a year to the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, middle of November 2021. Obviously, then the big news this year has been the Inflation Reduction Act. But there's also been a number of states moving to phase out the sale of gas cars altogether, setting binding targets for electrifying cars and for electrifying trucks through the Clean Truck Rule and the Clean Fleet Rule. So on the policy front, there's been huge developments. On the economic and industry front, there have also been huge developments, including war in Ukraine, which has reminded us all about the fragility of depending on oil as our only transportation fuel. Major announcements from virtually all OEMs about new electric vehicle models, new vehicle types coming to market, including a number of real prestige brands like Mustang and F-150 going electric, as well as a number of new market entrants. It's also been a huge year for investments in the private sector in the charging networks. And it's also been a huge year reminding us all about the imminence of climate change. I know here in Oregon, where I live, we've seen record heat waves and record ice storms and record wildfire seasons just in the last year or so. So it's been a heck of a year. We have a panel here to talk with us about it. First of all, we have Garrett Fitzgerald, who's Senior Director of Electrification at the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Garrett leads SEPA's work focused on beneficial electrification of transportation and buildings, and collaborates with the other SEPA pathway teams to help utilities and stakeholders navigate a smooth transition to a highly electrified, low-carbon future. We have Leslie Hayward, who's Manager of Policy Communications at Rivian. And yes, if you could all just turn on your cameras as I'm introducing you, so we can put a face to the name. Leslie Hayward is Manager of Policy Communications at Rivian, one of those exciting new electric vehicle startups. Not even that new anymore, I suppose. But Leslie leads media relations, messaging strategy, grassroots outreach for the public policy team at Rivian, and has over a decade of experience in transportation electrification policy and oil market analysis. And finally, we have Steve Koerner, who's Vice President of Policy at BP Pulse. And Steve brings 2 decades of energy policy experience to BP Pulse, including 6 years on Capitol Hill and a dozen years as a lobbyist at the state and federal levels for solar storage and EV charging interests. So we've got a little bit of a setup for each of you, but I'd like to hear from each of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Steve. What's one transportation electrification headline that you were most excited to see in 2022? Well, and you have to unmute too.
There we go. Technology. Well, this is an easy one, and you give me a little heads up on this, Cynthia. If you could put up the headline. This is an easy one. That was my birthday, July 27th, where we got news that we were going to get a tax deal, and that became the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a game changer for the industry, for EV charging. The long sought reforms to the 30C tax credit, and some that weren't so long sought, weren't so welcome. Creation of the 30% commercial EV tax credit, and $169 billion for clean energy overall between grants and tax credits. So that to me was just game changer, and by far the number one headline of the year.
Great. Garrett, I see you on my screen next. Do you want to share a headline with us?
Yeah, sure. If I can, just two, because I have one that's an obvious one, like Steve's, and one that's a little more nuanced. The obvious one is when California just banned gas-powered cars. So, I think this was kind of bringing what we've seen to Europe here into North America, and really kind of emphasizing we are moving in that direction. It's not till 2035. But the more nuanced one, I think, and maybe we'll get into this, is CPU decision makers, California's first state to allow sub-metering of electric vehicles. So again, this is nuanced, but this is a thing that's long been a challenge, in that if we wanted to do managed charging, you need to have a utility grade meter that's doing that metering, and now there's sub-metering allowed to do some managed charging. And so this is the first in the nation, both in California for the ban and for the sub-metering. And what we have seen is a lot of what happens in California kind of sets the precedent for what can happen in other states. So 2 things that I'm pretty excited about.
All right, Leslie, take us home.
Well, I have to echo Steve's enthusiasm for that Politico headline. That notification, for I think for all of us in energy policy in Washington was huge, and that's hard to beat. But with my Rivian hat on, I would say that beginning our customer deliveries of the first electric pickup in America this year, that was a pretty cool headline, and something to see, as well as. But I think what, in a bigger picture sense, what I was heartened, and I think it shows the challenge and the opportunity, in response to high oil prices, that EV orders were going up 100, 200% nationwide, depending on the OEM. The headlines about the consumer response to surging oil prices, I think, is a reminder that we've been in a place of complacency with oil prices ever since they collapsed in 2014. but we still remain really, really vulnerable to that price volatility and our dependence on petroleum. So I was heartened to see that consumers are responsive in that way. But then immediately after those headlines, we also saw plenty of news coverage of people want electric cars and they can't build them fast enough. You can't get them. What do we do? And I think that was also an important development, and I'm sure it's one we're going to discuss quite a bit here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and moderator privilege, I will say one that I haven't heard that sticks with me was the announcement of the Justice 40 initiative out of the administration. I remember 8 or 10 years ago in early conversations about equity around electric vehicles, getting a lot of blank stares around the room. So that's another place where it feels like we've come a long way in the state of the conversation. I imagine we'll get into that a little bit more as well. So, all right, Simbi, I think you could take down the not suitable for work headline slide, and we'll get into the conversation. And again, please do submit your questions through the chat. I think we have a poll to kick things off, right, Simbi? So you want to put up the poll while you're thinking about those insightful questions that you want to lob at our panelists. We'd just like to know who's in the room. So if you give us a sense of how long you've been in the EV industry, and you could define that for yourself, what that means to you. But okay, we got votes coming in. We got a few more coming. Looks like an interesting distribution. I think we're seeing that quite a bit from folks that a lot of new folks in the industry over the last year or two, and then a few of us who are older than dirt and not necessarily a whole lot in between. So we'll see if we can speak to both ends of that curve. I was going to call it a duck curve, but maybe that's too much of an inside joke. All right, let's get into some of the other questions in discussion. And I will start by pitching each of these to one of you, but expect everybody to chime in. So argue, disagree, add color commentary to the first answer. But let's start with you, Steve. One of the big developments this year has been the federal NEVI charging investment of $7.5 billion that's now starting to roll out through formula funds and community grants. So how are you seeing that change the charging landscape, and what do you see going well or going not so well?
Well, I think it's always good to start with getting our terms straight. So there's really actually $5 billion exclusively for EV charging, another $2.5 billion for alternative fueling infrastructure, and they're different programs. So the $5 billion that everyone kind of thinks about is NEVI, the National EV Infrastructure Program. It's a state formula program for corridor charging. That means along federally designated alternative fuel infrastructure corridors. And then separately, there's a $2.5 billion competitive grant program run out of the U.S. Department of Transportation for alternative vehicle fueling infrastructure. And that's going to include hydrogen, propane, natural gas. Half of that is, again, for corridors that are designated by DOT. Another half of that's $1.25 billion for community charging. A lot of flexibility there. First of all, look, it would be great if there was more flexibility overall. Corridor charging is going to matter. And I think it's going to reassure a lot of potential buyers. Probably not the most efficient use of capital, but again, Congress is prerogative, and we're going to carry that out. In terms of implementation, I think that the kind of implementing agency for NEVI, which is the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation, and got a lot right. And the rules it's proposed so far, and that has not yet finalized, actually. So you've got to have 4 150 kilowatt chargers every 50 miles to fill out a corridor. That's pretty good. Once states fill out their corridors, they do have the ability to have flexibility in terms of where they're gonna spend other resources. Of course, more corridors may be added in the process. That's well done. In terms of problems, one thing, states are already moving forward with their RFPs, which is great. We love to see fast action, but we don't have finalized program rules, and that's especially challenging when it comes to the Buy America requirements for EV chargers. So I think it's really hard for anybody to submit a bid until they know what those rules are. And I think that we do need some alignment there. We either the states are going to have to back off a little bit, or DOT is going to have to really move forward and get that finalized. And a second thing I'd like to see that I haven't seen, and I'd like to see the final rules, is requirements for pull-through charging. I think the hardest sector to electrify is going to be long-haul trucking, point to point. Anything in a depot is going to be easy for trucks. Like I said, for passenger vehicles, there'll be uses, but that long-haul trucking sector, we really need pull-through charging, and we really need higher power chargers than 150. So I'd like to see a requirement, at least for pull-through charging. I'd love to see a 350 kilowatt charger at every site. And then the last thing I wouldn't mind seeing in the final rules is a little bit more flexibility in how we get to 4 chargers at 150 kilowatts per site. If you had 2 sites that are, half a mile apart and both have 2 150 kilowatt chargers, that actually that's easier on the grid in terms of connection. So a little flexibility there, I think we'd actually have a better outcome. But overall, I've been very impressed by what the joint office has done. And then as for the other program, which is the $2.5 billion for alternative fuel infrastructure, we're in wait and see. It's just a question of whether DOT puts out rules for comment, or they just open up a solicitation, which is what I'm hearing they might do. So that's what I got.
Great. And Leslie, of course, those pull-throughs are not just important for the long-haul trucks, they're important for the pickup trucks towing boats. So I imagine you probably agree with that, but do you or Garrett have other comments to add to that list of what's going well, what could be better?
I just wanted to kind of emphasize, Steve, your last point of the ability to look at what's good and feasible for the grid in the near term, I think is important, right? So we have these constraints where every 50 miles within a mile of, and that's to meet the consumer's need, right, of driving a vehicle. But adding a little flexibility to look at, what can we do in a timely fashion that the grid is capable of, and then thinking forward when 4 is not going to be enough in 5 years, those are going to grow. How do we do that? So really, it's just suggesting that to whatever degree we can work with the utilities to find out how do we do this most efficiently and most quickly, and maybe using flexibility of that half mile down the road, I think would go a long way.
Leslie, anything you want to add?
I would just add that I do think that there's still a little bit of an unmet need in terms of the corridor charging. Doing quite a bit of highway driving with our Rivian, not my personal Rivian, but our policy team's Rivian, in the last year or so. I would say that even on major interstates like I-95 corridor, where you would think that you never have problem getting a charge, it's still a problem. I've pulled up to, and it's a problem in a good way. I've pulled up to many fast charging stations, like where there's 4 or 5 chargers, and had to leave and go to another one because they're all occupied. So I think that's all I would add, is just that there's, we need to get those chargers in the ground as soon as possible to meet the growing need.
Yeah, I have just one fun statistic to kind of emphasize that I like to share. So we have a target of perhaps 20-30 million EVs by the end of the decade. So say really rough numbers, we're going to have 20 million level 2 chargers at home, and then maybe 200,000 DC fast chargers. So we have 2,500 days until we get to the end of the decade. So that's 80 DC fast charging ports per day and 8,500 level 2s installed per day, every day from now until the end of the decade. We can do it, but it's a lot of work. And I think the money that Steve outlined, will definitely not get us that far. So it's a good starting point, and we're going to need to bring in more private sector funding, probably more state and federal funding, and look for alternative ways to finance this really rapid deployment.
We have a bunch of questions starting to come in, and encourage folks to keep posting those. We have a lot of topics we want to talk about, but maybe before we leave NEVI and charging, one that came in that I'm curious about is, anyone want to opine about the CHAdeMO standard and its relative lack of prominence in the NEVI rules so far? How concerned are we about those used leafs, and how are folks thinking about that?
Garrett, this has you written all over it, man. I'm a fleet charging guy.
Yeah, I know SEPA does work in the standard space, but I usually let my expert colleague Aaron Smallwood take care of those questions. I think I would say that there is some concern for those older vehicles and how do we not leave them behind. But I do think you're starting to see at least some industry consensus in North America on really the two other standards. And I'm not going to comment how we'll deal with CHAdeMO. It's an issue that some folks will have to address. But SEPA is, not an entity that can, or neither is any entity that can dictate standards. So I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. I do hear folks saying CHAdeMO is dead and we won't see them in North America. And then I hear an equally loud group of people saying that's just not true. So,
if you don't want to opine on that, you can also talk about the Tesla North America charging standard if you'd rather.
The standard that they just claimed would be the way. That's a fun one to debate on, right? I think they, of course, have the most number of DC fast chargers out there by double. However, it's all going to be, will OEMs adopt that? And I really think that I can't predict the future, but if I had to guess, there will be the Teslas and there'll be the rest of them in 10 years from now. And I'm pretty sad that that's the way it's going to be.
Steve,
I just want to say, what isn't in the rules or the proposed rules is a requirement for CHAdeMO. It doesn't mean it's optional. This is the kind of thing where the market sometimes can fix these things, whether by just showing that there's sufficient demand. Remember, charging companies are in the business of selling electrons. They're going to want to serve the market. So I wouldn't count CHAdeMO out in terms of infrastructure right away. And there's all kinds of opportunities for adapters. Tesla's already demonstrated that. So I think that it's doubtful that that CHAdeMO drivers will be left behind. They may not have quite as much access, but if there's a market opportunity, companies are going to find a way to serve it.
Okay. Well, while we move along, I want to talk about that other bill that passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, and maybe start this one with you, Garrett. There's a lot of attention to the NEVI program. There's a lot of attention to some of the dedicated EV programs, but there's, I haven't added it up, but let's just safely say many billions of dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act that could support transportation electrification, but are very flexible. So there's programs like State Energy Program, Energy Efficiency, Community Block Grants, Environment and Climate Justice Block Grants. What is SEPA doing? What should we all be doing to make sure that those funds are invested well?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you kind of, be careful what we just wish for. We're asking for a lot of flexibility. I think maybe it comes to $50 billion that EVs are eligible. But I think when you look at NEVI and you look at IIJA and the IRA, the two big buckets of money that we have, what is great is that there is a lot of dedication to incentivizing the vehicles to be sold, supporting domestic supply chains to build those vehicles, and then also a whole bucket of money for the charging infrastructure. So I think that's the good thing. We are covering both the vehicle and the infrastructure because it's not the chicken and the egg. We need both of them at the same time and build them up over time. The other thing that I would say is there is a lot of money and it is flexible, an unprecedented amount, but I'll emphasize again, it's not going to be enough to get us where we need to go. So with that out of the way, to answer your question, right, there's three buckets of money. That's money that's specific to electric vehicles. So there's a carve out for those. Money that's specific to charging, and then money that's very flexible, that's a little bit more outcome driven. Is trying to say, are you addressing air pollution projects? Are you addressing schools, neighborhoods, etc.? And I think the most important thing in what SEPA is doing is to help these new stakeholders who really haven't had any exposure to electric vehicles and are now really kind of being thrown into the deep end, whether that's a Department of Transportation that's supporting the NEVI plans and their staff is just now thinking about it, or if that's a state energy office that is needing some support. So we're trying to provide guidance to those making the plans, but also importantly, those receiving the funds. So for example, the EPA school bus funds, now there are hundreds of school districts who are going to be taking ownership of electric buses for the first time. Some of them, maybe I've heard, weren't even aware that the manufacturer was applying on their behalf, and now they're happy to take the bus, but they're going to need some support on that. And so I guess to summarize, it really is, we're all navigating this transition and we're doing it quickly. And so we need to make sure entities like Fourth and SEPA and others are providing that education and guidance as we do it. And lastly, to be okay with a couple of missteps. So we're going to put a lot of money out there. And if we go up front and say, there's going to be 1 or 2 electric school buses that don't really get implemented well, but if we expect that and we're okay with it, then we can continue to move forward. But if we get caught up and say, this was a bad idea, why are we doing this? We're going to be in a bad spot. So I really think it's having some patience and recognizing this is going to be a hard transition, but we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Leslie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously significant changes were made to the electric vehicle tax credit, and that has a really direct impact on consumers. There's a lot of drivers for whom that $7,500 is a make or break factor in whether they're going to make that transition to an electric vehicle for their home or for their business. And there's a lot of complexity that was added. Even how you file your taxes could impact your eligibility. We have a direct relationship with our customers through our direct sales model. And so we are kind of on the front lines of receiving those inbounds. And the lack of clarity that's been created, I think, really is a problem. And we're all still waiting on that guidance from the Treasury Department on how, we're going to, first of all, meet these really aggressive timelines on a domestic battery supply chain, which I would also add is one that Rivian entirely shares. Absolutely, we need that supply chain to be domesticized. We need those minerals to come from the safest and cleanest mines in the world, which we can have here in North America. And we need to be making sure that we're really capturing all the beneficial job creation that results. But again, the timeline is very aggressive, and it's a big question mark for consumers. What I am heartened by, though, in the IRA is the augmentation to the commercial vehicle tax credit. So it's 30% of the incremental cost, and it increased up to 40% of the incremental cost for the largest classes of vehicles. So we're hoping that that's going to really accelerate adoption and send a clear signal to large fleets that the time is now to make that transition and to start adopting zero emission heavy duty vehicles.
Anything you want to add before we move on, Steve?
Things that we can be doing to support electrification. I guess I have 2 answers. One, in terms of the kind of the funds that could go to electrification, just flag that there's $3 billion for emission reductions at ports. That's in the IRA, an opportunity to electrify drayage, gantry cranes, forklifts. I think it's an exciting market. So if you work for a port authority or a terminal operator, give me a call. I'm working on that. That's an exciting one. And in terms of more conventional stuff, the rules regarding implementation of the new 30C reforms really going to matter a lot. A couple items that if people want to weigh in on that really can make a difference is what constitutes an actual item for fueling infrastructure. This is new because it's a multi-technology credit. They got to figure out what each individual item is, because now the tax credit is based not on the site, the location, but each item. And in terms of the long run, I think we're going to want to have each charging port that can operate simultaneously be an item. So what you could see, for instance, is a charging cabinet with up to like a megawatt charging cabinet, so that if you get a big rig that comes in that could take something close to that, it could take it. But then you may have 6 ports off of that all can operate at, I'm not a math guy, but let's say 175 kilowatts. We want each of those ports to be considered a separate item. Otherwise, that 1 megawatt cabinet is going to meet the caps, which is $100,000 per item for the tax credit. But the other big one is what constitutes a non-urban census tract. relative to 30C. This is getting very technical. The abbreviated version, and it goes pretty deep, is that there's a geographic restriction on the use of 30C to non-urban census tracts. There is no such a thing. The Census Bureau does not do urban and rural census tracts. It does census blocks. And so we're going to have to determine what a non-urban census tract is. That's something I'm working on, and I would encourage anyone involved in the industry to lobby Treasury and the IRS to say that a census tract with like 10% of its blocks being rural is certainly not urban. And that's what the legislation says. It doesn't say rural census tract. It says non-urban. So we could all just kind of make the case to Treasury that a non-urban census tract is one that is not entirely urban. We're going to get a lot more opportunity to use that tax credit. So just wanted to flag that one for folks.
Yes, and if folks on the call have not delved into this long list of IRA programs, you're just getting a flavor for some of the kinds of questions that will be keeping us all busy for a while yet. I want to move on. I think Garrett mentioned, the programs that we have are addressing a couple of the biggest barriers to transportation electrification. The vehicles, the vehicle cost, charging infrastructure. One that we were sort of disappointed they haven't really tackled yet is just the public awareness, that something like 75% of American consumers have still never experienced an electric vehicle. And we know that's the biggest predictor of considering and buying an electric vehicle. And a lot of us for years have been saying, oh, well, we just need, electric pickup truck because that's what Americans want. That's going to be a game changer. So pitching this one to you, Leslie, has it been? How are you seeing, beyond your great vehicle, how are you seeing consumer attitudes change, and what can we do to accelerate that?
Yeah, thank you. They're definitely, I think they're changing fast. I think people that, just a couple years ago were like buying an electric vehicle was totally out of the question. It's now on their radar. And, I'm very proud that with Rivian, about 75% of our customers are first-time EV buyers. And many of those buyers are people who've never even driven the vehicle, in fact. But of course, we can't count on that level of enthusiasm to carry the entire transition over the next decade. So one of the biggest and I think misunderstood barriers to EV adoption is kind of the legacy distribution model, the franchise dealerships, which in over 20 states are mandated as the only entity that can sell a new vehicle in the state. So there's like this, kind of outdated requirement for a middleman to be in between the buyer and the manufacturer. And I know that the Sierra Club is updating this research as we speak, but a study from just a couple of years ago showed that about 80% of dealers do not have an electric vehicle available for sale. And some recent survey research that organizations we're affiliated with have done show that kind of continues to be true. There's a couple dealers that are like Gold Star dealers. They're really pushing consumers to take that, the ID4, whatever, for a test drive, plug it in, see how it feels, get a sense of the amazing drivetrain, the acceleration. But a lot of the dealers are kind of just falling back on their bread and butter, and they're not quite ready yet to train their salespeople, to invest in the charging infrastructure, and to take that next step. So it's really incumbent on state legislatures and governors to evaluate how these outdated restrictions are holding back EV adoption. Because what we've seen is that in states that are open for direct sales from manufacturers, EV adoption is 5 times higher. And in some cases, it's more effective in terms of getting EVs on the road than even purchase incentives. So Florida has EV sales that are about double that of New York because they allow direct sales, and there's 15 Tesla locations in Florida. Whereas New York, ACC2 state, Governor Hochul has signaled that they're going to go 100% EVs for new vehicle sales by 2035, lagging behind Florida. So a little bit counterintuitive, but really getting people, in a position where they can learn and experience and test drive electric vehicles is still, really essential. And one other thing, Jeff, to speak to your point, is I know that electric pickups are game changing. They're exciting. There's so many fun things about the Rivian, like from the storage to the quad motor drive. But I'm actually, I think, a little bit prouder even of our van, because that van is in all communities. Commercial vehicles are the heaviest polluting and most highly utilized vehicles on the road, They're 10% of vehicles, but they're 25% of emissions, and they're disproportionate contributors to harmful air pollution that affect so many communities. And so I think the faster we get to medium and heavy duty deployment, the better.
Yeah, it's still pretty exciting to see one of those delivery vans coming down the street. Steve,
Jeff, can I
Garrett,
offer just like
yeah,
a
other
comment
thoughts?
on? I think it's helpful to remind all of us, if we're going to do this education and outreach, that 2/3 of American buy used cars, right? I think there's 16 million new car sales and 45 million used car sales. So let's not forget that whole demographic of people that maybe aren't interacting with EVs by looking at the mainstream auto
Mhm.
commercials. And so how do we educate those folks that are buying in the secondhand market? But then also recognize the secondhand market is or has been pretty wonky recently, right? It was more
Yeah.
expensive to buy a used car than a new car. So I think like just looking at our ability to meet demand, you see consumers really want these EVs, and we need to work on meeting that demand. And there's a bunch of supply chain issues that are being addressed. But then we need to continue to think about, how do we educate folks that vehicles will be good candidates for second use vehicles and the batteries are going to work, and the infrastructure that we build for 2028 also can serve those older vehicles that maybe have 150 or 200-mile range. So kind of thinking about including everybody in the future that we are planning for.
Let me do a follow up and kind of put you on the spot a little bit there, Garrett. That kind of outreach and education, that's not the Super Bowl ads, that's not selling the prestige new vehicles. That's something that a lot of folks, myself included, have been hoping utilities would pick up, and not many utilities yet have really robust consumer engagement programs. Not many regulators have let them. Um, do you see that changing, or do you think we're mistaken to expect that from utilities? And if so, who should be doing that work?
Yeah, so I think it's probably both, that the utilities are putting more intentionality in developing outreach and education that's specific for low and moderate income or specific community groups. But also regulators are approving more spend dedicated to education and dedicated to these particular community groups. Because if you look at the approved spending, I think in the past 2 years, maybe $2.5 billion has been approved for transportation electrification infrastructure investment. And I'm guessing, and don't quote me, like 900 million of that is earmarked for equity communities. And so I think there is now money to do it. But what I've learned is that we've just completed a project in partnership with EPRI and 8 utilities, where in many cases the utility may not have that level of trust that is needed to provide that education with these community groups, and they're building it up. And so you hear it a lot when we talk about equity. The local community-based organizations, they need to be your partner, they need to be your paid partner, and they can help go out and create that education. And you kind of saw it in this chat here. Teresa mentioned how effective it is, that word of mouth, showing your peer, this works for me. It's not just for the Tesla owner in San Francisco. So I think utilities have a role, but utilities alone aren't going to be able to be successful. And so we all have to kind of support that.
Yeah, I'll take advantage to give a shout out to one of our partners, Pacific Power here in Oregon, that has funded Forth to do a lot of that outreach with a mobile showroom that we tow behind an electric vehicle around the state. But again, it's that utility role in supporting the work, but not necessarily always being the face of it or leading that work in community. I want to pivot to a different topic. And Steve, you've been a little quiet last few minutes. So if I can,
Never been said about me before.
yeah, I was going to say uncharacteristically quiet, but I don't know you that well. But so as part of BP, I want to throw this one at you for starters. One of the issues off and on for a decade or two has been, how do we stop buying oil from people who don't like us? And the names and locations of the people who don't like us have changed over the years, but the problem just keeps coming back. It seems like this has been the biggest oil shock since the Mideast oil embargo, for those of us who are old enough to remember that. Do you agree or disagree? And do you think this is going to have long-term impacts on electrification, or will it be like past price spikes where as soon as it drops again, people go back to buying, big gas guzzling SUVs? A lot to unpack there, but take your best shot.
I remember when gas prices hit $3 about 10 years ago, and I was absolutely stupefied by that. And then they went back down, and that, I think consumers are used to gas prices going up and down over time, and they tend not to react in the long run to that volatility. It's just what's the situation now. And my general take is that gas prices aren't going to do our work for us as a sector. The issue for EVs really is the upfront price of the vehicles for most consumers. And until that approaches parity with internal combustion engine vehicles, EVs are going to be just a fraction of new cars sold. That's reality. Some of the reforms to the Section 30D tax credit aren't going to make this any easier, with the certain requirements that will just make it harder to apply. But that tipping point is going to come one way or another. It's just, we don't have tax credits. As battery prices fall, as the sector scales, we're going to get to a point where the sticker price for comparable vehicles is going to be the same. And when that happens, it's game over. I cannot imagine what it would take to want to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle then, because there's going to be people with specific use cases. I drive 400 miles a day every day, and I can't charge. Well, okay. But beyond that, they're just going to be more expensive to own and operate. There's going to be long-term uncertainty about parts and service. Resale is going to be terrible. And so, the market is going to get us there eventually. I don't think gas prices will. I think that if 30D had been, not handcuffed the way it has, or whatever analogy you want to create for that, we'd get there quicker. But we're going to get there. And then the only other part is, when that moment comes, we need to have the charging infrastructure in place, because people aren't going to be comfortable buying. Range anxiety is a real thing. They're not going to be comfortable buying unless they feel confident that they're going to be able to charge. It's not chicken versus egg stuff. The simple fact is, charging has to come first. And fortunately, the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, is a great first step in that direction.
Garrett or Leslie, anything you want to add to that?
I think maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic about how I talk about it. I kind of feel like we are at the tipping point. Like, the folks that I speak to pretty much all acknowledge that we will be going full electric at some point, right? And so for me, that's the tipping point. What you're talking about, Steve, is how quickly do we get to that price point where then there's an inflection in uptake. And I think you're absolutely right. It's does battery costs come down enough that you can have parity? And then you're saying, hey, same car, but you're going to pay a fourth in fuel and a fourth in maintenance. Then everybody, and by the way, it's a better car, it's quicker. Then you're going to get everyone buying those. I think the reason I say we're at the tipping point is, you can see year on year over the past 2 years, the number of models has doubled, right? 10 years ago, we had 2 models. Now we have 160 models by the end of this year that are available. That is also what people need to see, right? Americans like choice. They like to be, not everyone drives a pickup. So I think we're at the tipping point, but the acceleration point, we're not there yet. And we absolutely have to put the stuff in place to have the charging infrastructure when that happens. We cannot wait for this really hockey stick to happen, and we're like, oh my gosh, we didn't have the necessary infrastructure.
I want to jump to, it does seem like this is a classic supply demand game we're playing. I'll share my personal story, which is, my 2016 e-Golf that gets 75 miles of range on a beautiful warm day with a tailwind has doubled in value in the last 2 years.
I drive an e-Golf. I didn't know anyone else did. Fantastic.
Yeah. I don't get any Volkswagen kickbacks here, but yeah,
I used to work for Electrify America, so I didn't know that actually happened. That's fantastic. Okay.
So I think what we're seeing right now, as someone said, was gas prices go up, other things happen. There's suddenly a lot of demand for electric vehicles. Also in the U.S., this is idiosyncratic because there isn't a comparable Volkswagen, and some people, like my family, are just German car fanatics. But I guess the question is, given all that supply chain disruption that we're seeing, and the constraints we're seeing right now, the people who really want to buy electric cars, they just can't get them because they aren't available. I've certainly had people ask me, why are you doing outreach and ride and drives and telling people how great these vehicles are, because they can't buy them? So how long do we think, I think the question is, how long do we think that these lack of availability is going to be a major problem? And what should we all be doing in the meantime? Should we not be telling people about electric vehicles? Should we just be quietly building a lot of charging infrastructure? But how do we respond to these supply chain disruptions? How long do we think they're going to last? And I'm gonna pitch it to you first, Leslie.
Yeah, I respect Garrett and Steve's optimism. I have concerns though, and not necessarily with Rivian, and with, because we're ramping production fairly quickly, and every vehicle that we sell is electric. But I think that that when you don't have vehicles available to people when they need a car, then they're not coming back to the market for another 10 years in a lot of cases. So I do think that the lack of availability is a kind of a bigger problem than we're realizing. And I also think that, unfortunately, and I don't mean to just keep going back to the problems with the dealer model, but we've seen astonishing price gouging from dealers this year. I think that according to Edmunds, 82% of vehicles this year were sold above MSRP. That's up from 3% last year. That's pretty bad. That's a huge equity issue as well. The fact that most people would rather get a root canal than go to a dealer to begin with. But then you factor in the fact that there's not enough vehicles, gas or electric, and the people who want to go electric, there's the number of the best model for them might not be available, or there's like a 18-month wait, and then the dealer wants to add anywhere from 3 to 50K on top of the MSRP. That's really a serious problem. But I think the supply chain issues, there might be a silver lining in that the scarcity of certain materials or minerals is going to breed a lot of innovation. So one thing that I'm really optimistic about is LFP batteries. These are batteries that are less expensive because they don't require a lot of higher cost minerals to produce, and they don't require any cobalt. So it's with more abundant minerals. It's lithium iron phosphate. There's less toxic, like metals that have a toxic component to them, and it's a much more durable battery chemistry. So actually, they have double the number of charge cycles in their lifetime, and so they're cheaper, they're longer lasting. They might not have that breakneck acceleration you get from some of the traditional and highly desired EV batteries that we have now. But they're a great chemistry, and there's so many fantastic applications for LFP batteries. So I think that's just one example of the kind of developments that are happening in the space because of these supply chain constraints.
Garrett, Steve, either of you want to hazard a guess how long this shortage is going to last, or an opinion about what we should do about
Don't look at me. I'm a charging guy.
it?
Yeah, I'm going to pass too.
I guess that's the easy answer.
Back to your question about what we do in the meantime, I do think we just keep building infrastructure in the meantime, get more fast chargers on the road, make sure that the people who have been able to make that leap into an electric vehicle are having a really great experience, telling their friends, not wanting to switch gears and roll back. And I think more ACT policies as well to expedite commercial vehicle deployment is key.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one nuance on that is that, we do need to build charging infrastructure, but we need to also make sure that we're maintaining it and there's uptime and there's a good experience, because, you hear this year a lot about complaints on, I went to a charger and it wasn't up, and, that's a really bad experience. But you recognize, if you're Electrify America or you're a company that's operating it, there's a cost to that, and if we're expecting a rapid expansion of this infrastructure that might not be utilized for some time due to these constraints we just talked about, how do we address that, right? How do we match kind of the longer term or the more patient capital that's needed that will eventually be used? Hopefully, I do have some questions of, how much the public network will be used in the long run, but I don't want to get into that debate right now.
Okay. Yeah, and there's certainly no supply chain problems in the charging industry, right? Since I've been watching the some of the questions coming in from attendees, and while we're on that, there were a couple of questions about uptime. 97% in the draft rule. Anyone want to comment on, is that adequate, inadequate, possible, impossible? Any comments about how we improve the charging experience and reliability?
That has to go to Steve.
Yeah, so we're a fleet charging company. It's all depots for us. But no, joking aside, look, it depends on how you calculate 97%. If you do it by charger, I think that is well beyond industry standard and will be very challenging. If you do it by site, it's actually low. You should at least have one charger operational. So I think the rules are going to make a big difference here. But I think the one thing that we could do to improve the situation is to require longer warranties on the chargers themselves. Right now, the standard is 2 years. And frankly, if you only require a 2-year warranty, well, you're going to get chargers that tend to last 2 years. And then after that, good luck. So I think states would be very wise, for instance, in NEVI to require a minimum of 5-year warranties or make it a 10-year warranty. And this should be long-term infrastructure. And the best way to get to more reliable infrastructure is to put better chargers in the ground in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, while we're on charging, one of the other questions that came in, actually a couple of questions that came in were around vehicle to grid or vehicle to everything, which, as has been said about other technologies, is kind of feels like the technology of the future, and always will be. I know we've been excited about it for 11 years that I've been doing this work, but what are you seeing that gives you hope that we're actually moving towards deploying this in programs at scale, if anything? And if not, what's it going to take? And I got to start with you on this one, Garrett, I think.
Yeah, and SEPA actually just put out a report that kind of evaluated where different stakeholder groups are at on that subject. But I'll try to answer kind of simply. I think what's giving me hope is, a couple of years ago, it was just the Nissan that had this commercial capability. And now you look at the vehicles that have some degree of it, the Rivian, the Ford 150 Lightning, and I think 4 or 5 other OEMs have some degree, whether that's just vehicle to load or vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to home. The other thing is you see these pilots where the major California IOUs are partnering with GM and Ford and others to figure out how to do it, right? So I still think we're not there yet of where we need to be, but we're making big strides to figure out how do we bridge that gap and get there. And the last thing is, I think several years ago, it would void everybody's warranty if you did this. And now that's written into the warranty. So that's probably the biggest indication that this is likely to happen to some degree. I'll let others kind of share their thoughts as well.
Yeah, and Steve, with depots and fleet vehicles, this ought to be easy as cake, right?
We'd love to do it, but it's the old solar guy in me that's very skeptical of it happening anytime soon. And that's because this is like net metering in some respects, and the utilities aren't going to make any money on it under current structures. The simple fact is they have the ability to express concerns about reliability and safety with V2G applications. And until we get them on board fully, and they're a partner that can actually make money on V2G, I would caution everyone on the webinar not to hold their breath.
Good. Reinforcing, I think what I'm hearing is what I've been telling people for years, which is this is not a technical or engineering problem. This is a business case, policy, economic problem primarily. Right?
Yeah, well, it'll be a technical and engineering problem until the business case is solved, and then it'll all of a sudden be technically possible.
Yeah, well, I think also like we should consider what the customer wants or is willing to do, right? If you buy a vehicle for a vehicle, let's make sure that we're thinking about them being able to use the vehicle for the vehicle, because oftentimes you have conversations with the utility or the OEM about all of these great possibilities, but it gets back down to that business case. How are you going to compensate the customer, or who are you going to compensate? Is it the customer or is it the OEM? And so I think getting those things worked out and being able to make the payment for the value to
Yep.
whoever's kind of taking the risk or putting in the money, well, that needs to be solved.
Meanwhile, we'll just have to make do with keeping our cooler running off of our Rivian, right, Leslie?
It's a big selling point, and yeah, I echo Garrett's point about consumer demand, and I think as more people consider this and it becomes a true value proposition, it's part of making the switch to electric vehicles. I mean, being able to run your fridge in a hurricane and being able to just have some creature comforts during a power outage because of that big battery in your garage. I think that's going to become something that people aren't willing to go without, knowing that the capability is right at their fingertips.
Okay, and I think we're getting the subtle clue from Simbi that we need to wrap this up. Simbi, do we have time for 60-second?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so very quickly, sort of 15 seconds or less, what's one headline that you're hoping to see or afraid you might see in 2023? And Garrett, I'll go with you first.
This one's too optimistic, but supply chain issues are a thing of the past for electric vehicles.
Nice. Steve?
How about Joe Biden celebrates groundbreaking of BB Pulse's GigaHub network? It's something we're trying to build in partnership with Hertz at airport locations targeting ride-hail drivers. I mean, we're going to need federal assistance to do it, but I hope they see the value and the opportunity to reduce emissions and from an area that is increasing vehicle miles traveled.
Okay, Leslie?
Let's see. Maybe not a headline, but I'd like to see a universal approach to combating EV misinformation. I think that's one of the biggest things holding back the industry. We didn't really get to discuss it today, but there's a lot of unfortunate myths out there that are unfortunately pervasive. And I think in terms of one thing I'd like to see, expanded adoption of advanced clean trucks programs to continue the momentum on commercial electric vehicles, as well as battery recycling breakthroughs.
Okay, great. Well, time flies. Thank you all for joining us. I know we could do this for another hour or two if we had the time, but we'll have to close it out here and continue this a year from now, maybe. Hand it back to Sippy.
Jeff, I was going to pose the question to you as well. What is one headline you're looking forward to seeing in 2023?
Well, I'll follow up on Leslie's. I'd like to see major federal investment in EV education and outreach, so that the subtext being, I'll never again have to read another social media post about how EVs are worse for the environment than Hummers. Someday before I retire,
Don't hold your breath on that either. Social media.
Thank you all so much for joining the final webinar of the year as we wrap up the 2022. And we hope to keep the conversation going. Here are the contact info for our speakers. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much, Garrett. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Jeff, for facilitating the discussion. And since we're in the season of giving, we're going to give you a sneak preview to our 2023 webinar season. We have 5 curated webinars for you. We're taking a break in May for the Roadmap Conference, so we'll be back in June. So we're going to start with assessing the impact of EV car sharing models. We're going to talk strategies to accelerate electric micromobility, state transportation electrification strategies, EV charging at multifamily housing and the workplace, and we'll wrap it up with federal community grants programs and the Justice 40 initiative. We hope these conversations are enticing you already to register, so we will be sending a link to you all. And finally, we just want to say thank you again for an amazing 2022. And we'll see you hopefully virtually before that, but we hope to see you in person at the Roadmap Conference, May 15th through the 17th. Thank you all again, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week and a good rest of 2022. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh.